If I could give you just a quick rundown to start this morning on what we'll be talking about, coming up in about 15 minutes, 10, 15 minutes, we'll be joined by Ella Donahue from the College of Southern Idaho. We were talking with her, I think, about a Celtic festival coming up last week. She'll have more details on that this week. Speaking of Celts, my friend Jake Smith, who has family in Scotland, is going to be joining us just after the 8:40 break this morning. Jake is a former host at the Travel Channel at one time in his life, and he was working in television news. He has done radio, talk radio, music radio, and now he is a safety consultant for several television networks, as well as a consultant on the last couple of reality shows that Ted Nugent did. And he and Ted Nugent actually became very good friends during the course of those two shows. Jake was also, in fact, the safety consultant. You want to talk about a tall order on the TV show Jackass. But when they were doing the movie, because he was a little too strict about some of the stunts, they told him they no longer needed his services. He's going to join us today because he stumbled across a link a few days ago. Idaho is one of the most dangerous states. We're not talking about crime, believe me, not talking about crime. Idaho is one of the most dangerous states in the union, though, and he's going to talk with us about how people could perhaps go about their lifestyles a bit more safely than they've been doing. It's 47 at our studios, 8 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. I have to admit, I'm doing this show. I feel like I'm in a cave this morning. That's because one of the overhead lights is out. Well, I'll put it this way. The immediate overhead light is out. There is a light on the other side of the studio that happens to be on, barely. So we've got a little bit of light coming in from that corner, but otherwise, I feel like I'm doing the show in a cave. I really should think about that, though. Wouldn't that be cool? Some morning, we go up to the caves and we just do the show live from there. I could be down underneath. I was doing a television story once at a place called Howe Caverns, which is somewhere sandwiched between the Adirondack and Catskill mountain ranges back east. And we were interviewing a fellow deep down in the cavern, and I turned to the photographer who was working with me, and I said, Jim, if there was an earthquake right now, and here we are 200 feet below the surface, people will say, and that was the last anyone ever saw of Jim and Bill again. And we laughed about it. We got back to work. We left the cavern. We got back to work. And there was a fellow at work by the name of Kevin. Kevin was the chief engineer, and Kevin said, did you feel the earthquake? Huh? He said, there was an earthquake in Rotterdam, New York, a 3.2 while you guys were down underneath the ground. We never felt a thing. Never felt a thing. On the other hand, I have felt earthquakes when they had the big quake in Mineral, Virginia, just outside of Washington a few years ago. I certainly felt that. Our studios at work, we were, of course, probably 120 miles away. Our studios at work ended up with cracks along the ceiling lines where the ceiling would meet the walls. As a result of that, it was somewhat of an unpleasant experience that day, let me tell you. I also woke up a couple of times feeling the aftershocks from it over the next several days. I was at a party for one of my grandmothers about 25 years ago, and I was talking with my brother when we suddenly realized the wine in the wine glasses on some of the tables, the wine was shaking back and forth. And later we found out that hundreds of miles away there had been a quake in Quebec City. And we were just feeling some of the shocks from that considerable distance away. Now, Benito was telling me this morning that nobody really in southern Idaho would have felt the quakes that took place. There were two, not one, but two, that were centered in northern Idaho that took place in the last 24 hours. He said no one here would feel those. I have a suspicion, though, that some people may have had at least a sensation that something, because they're big enough in that 4 range that you would have some radiation coming out from that. What's interesting about all of this is that yesterday, some researchers from the University of Utah released their findings. They were doing studies on the magma core beneath Yellowstone National Park. If you're a fan of the KLIX Facebook page, you may have already seen this. I posted it last night after seeing it myself, a link to the story on our Facebook page, and it's now up to close to, last time I looked, we were near 700 hits. 700 people had viewed that, which is probably not a record, but it's going to approach one at this pace. So it really caught people's attention. There are actually 2 magma cores beneath Yellowstone. There is one that's good-sized already, and then just below that is a much more massive pool. This pool is 1,000 kilometers deep, which tells you it goes down toward that core of the earth a long, long distance. And I have the story here in my hands. Now, it's not quite as light in here. Trying to read in the dark is going to be a little bit of a problem for me today. Benito got through it, but you understand, he's considerably younger than I am, and his eyesight hasn't failed him. And I'm starting from what you'd call already a bit of a disadvantage in that only one side works. The other side just has a lens to sort of, fill things out. Otherwise, I could walk around in a monocle and probably shout orders all day at work and get people to obey them. But I'm going to try to get through this. This was a Washington Post story about that study. Scientists find missing link in Yellowstone plumbing. This giant volcano is very much alive. Now, according to the writers, if this thing were to go off in a very, very big explosion, the eastern half of the Snake River Valley would go with it. Not necessarily affecting Twin Falls, although we'd feel a lot of rumbling. We might get a lot of ash, depending on which way the wind was blowing. And I don't feel any animosity toward the people who live east of the park. But if this thing were to eventually blow, and I happen to be living in this part of Idaho, I would hope, at least for my own sake, that the winds were blowing quite strongly that day and blowing out of the northwest. And they would take all of that ash and all of that gas and all of that just completely out of our way and send it eastward. I know that's not a nice thought for the people who live downwind, but it would be helpful at least if you lived here. You don't necessarily want to be directly underneath some of that when it comes crashing down on you. There would still be, if this thing goes off, and it goes off in a major explosion, there would still be a lot of debris raining down over this area. You'd have to recognize that. People have warned about this for years. On those disaster shows that you see on some of the cable stations, there has been a lot of talk about this, that if this were to happen, this could really paralyze the United States for decades. Or what had been the United States would be paralyzed for decades. So I was looking through all of this, and it gives some details on this. Obviously, it may not happen in our lifetimes. So one more thing to worry about, right, that we don't necessarily need to. But I've highlighted a few lines here, and I'm going to try to read these by the light from the distant wall over here. The writer says this is a volcano that can erupt either in a big way or a truly colossal and catastrophic way. The last time that Yellowstone had a calderic eruption was 640,000 years ago, and the misshapen hole it created was about 25 miles by about, and I think it's a slight misprint here, but it was about 70 miles across. The main visual evidence of the old caldera is the striking absence of mountains at the heart of the mark. They were literally blown away in the last eruption. Mountains simply just blown away, disintegrated. That's how powerful it was. One of the researchers, his name is Smith, it says Smith said the repeat time for a caldera explosion at Yellowstone is roughly 700,000 years. So 640,000 years ago was the last really big one. So we're a lot closer to the next big one happening. On the other hand, it's not like a clock. It's not ticking towards 700,000 years, tick, 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 and when it gets there, bing, it goes off again. Give or take 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 years. So yes, it could not happen again for another 60,000 years or 100,000 years, and it doesn't really matter to us if it happens that far out in the distance. You're not going to know anybody who it happens to. On the other hand, could happen tomorrow is what they're telling us. So that's just something that you have to keep in mind when you have something like this. The writer goes on to say, the processes don't follow clocks, and that's what I was just pointing out. Yellowstone, according to the writer, is unpredictable. So one more worry, all of these worries about is there going to be a big war in the Middle East? Will it involve the United States? Is the economy going to hold through the next couple of years until we can finally get some decent people into the White House that know what they're doing? We've been asking ourselves all of these questions in talk radio for so long, and now you've got to be asking yourself, does it really all matter if that thing goes up? And if it goes up in a massive explosion like the one 640,000 years ago, how quickly will we all be toast? No one wants to suffer. I'm bringing that up. You remember, if you see those old excavations, and some people have probably seen those photographs from Pompeii, well, they were much more directly in line. The gas itself was what killed those people. It wasn't necessarily the rocks that were falling down, although that may have had something to do with it. A few large rocks on the top of your head would very much be a hindrance to your survival. but it really was the gas. And it wasn't the fact that they were covered in lava or anything like that. The gas choked them all to death, horribly in many cases, because what happened after they died, a lot of that ash and the rocks then covered all of them up, and they were buried for millennia. And when finally Pompeii was excavated, we had these shapes of people, the remnants of them, petrified there in the streets. So we know how they died, contorted in various positions as the end came. And there were people who were found inside buildings who had taken refuge thinking, aha, I won't get conked on the head by all of that pumice and ash. I'll just sit in here until it's all over with. Well, and again, even if they had survived the gas, which was next to impossible in that situation, they would have had to then try to dig themselves out of, a mountain of that ash and rock, which would have likely been next to impossible too, and then they would have just starved to death quite slowly inside. They would have been entombed in those buildings. So depending on where it blows, how strong it blows, and which directions, I guess, the wind are blowing that particular day would have a lot to do with anyone's particular survival. Bill Colley with you. It's 8:17 this morning on Top Story. Our temperature 47. Looking for some rain coming in later today and, of course, tomorrow morning as well. We have a caller with us. You're next on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Welcome.
Well, according to the national media and our president, another gas that we've got to be really concerned about, not only volcanic gas, but CO2. And, it's just beyond reason that CO2, which is necessary for life on the planet to produce oxygen and food, is considered a pollutant.
Yes.
This is unbelievable. And the letter to the editor today just riles me up as a plant scientist. I mean, people wake up and smell the coffee because it's just unbelievable. Our president, that's more critical as far as a problem than the ISIS and all the terrorism going on and so forth. I just wanted to make that comment because it's just unbelievable.
Hey, thank you much for the call. I've got about 30 seconds before we hit the break, a hard break, but we'll take a very quick telephone call. You're up next.
Yeah, Bill, this will be fast. I think we just need to get the EPA down there really quick, and they need to find that volcano for discharge of bad gas. They need a different muffler or something on it.
They do. And, and it could kill a lot of the little critters in the area. We can't have that as well. So they'll have to definitely post a very large fine. And I wonder how a volcano, if it's contrite when it comes to court. I thank you much for the telephone call. You can see it walking in. It'd have to shuffle because it's very large. With the smoke pouring off the top, steam coming out of its ears, if you will, as it has to walk into the courtroom and pay that fine. Probably plead nolo contendere or something. 20 minutes now after 8 o'clock. 47 at our studios. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. Hey, it's almost the weekend. Let's have some fun, right? That's a good way to look at it because you know what? You could wake up tomorrow morning buried in ash. Some people have their heads buried in, well, never mind. We've got Ella Donahue on the way from the College of Southern Idaho in just a couple of minutes. You're listening to Bill Colley on Top Story. 47 at our studios. I had what we call a misfire on the soundboard, which rarely ever happens to me. But I had what we call a misfire while I was moving the mouse. Of course, this was not computerized when I first got into radio, but now everything is just run audio off the computers that are in front of you. And a couple of seconds of something came up, and well, you've got Paul McCartney right here, who, even though despite the Irish name, is an Englishman. Paul McCartney, this is, yeah, and so you think about that. Actually, Paul McCartney and, of course, the rest of the Beatles, whatever their names were, with Let It Be. Coming from a country like England, actually what I had the misfire was I accidentally stumbled across this. This is, I hit the button and it started going, but I figured, what the heck, I'm going to play it for you. This is about 25 years old. Margaret Thatcher was just finishing up her time as Prime Minister in Britain, and she was on the floor of Parliament during question time when she suddenly took a question from a very, very angry Liberal who happened to be on the other side of the floor. Take a listen.
That over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
That's right.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979. Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is the Liberal policy. Yes, it came out. He didn't intend it.
That was just beautiful. And I saw the video once of that. And the poor fellow, after shooting off his mouth, as she's caught him with his pants down, you can see him trying to like mouth the words that, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. She nailed him. And it's wonderful to hear something like that. I wish we had more of that. In England right now, they are facing a complete upheaval in government because what's going to happen in the early part of May, they have a general election. And there's been a lot of talk. See, the Conservative Party that she led is no longer nearly as conservative. She was opposed to joining the European Union, and what happened, there was some fallout after her successor, John Major, took the country into the European Union. So a lot of those old conservatives, the Thatcherites, left the party, and they formed their own party called the UK Independence Party, United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP for short. Unfortunately, they're going to win a lot of votes, but they're not going to win enough votes to really have any serious influence. They will be spoilers in that upcoming election, but they will not win many seats, which is unfortunate because if they did, they could perhaps restore some of the old marketplace values that have slipped in that country. It's unfortunate, but they're going through a lot of the same paroxysms we are when it comes to politics, and that is that you've got people who are used to living on the dole, and they don't want to see that go away. They don't mind that their neighbor is paying their freight. Before we wrap up this segment of the program, I've got to mention a couple of the people who make this show possible, including Western States Bus Services, where they are hiring part-time bus drivers right now, split shifts 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. The pay is $10.75 per hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. I've mentioned it before. Ella Donahue from CSI, she just left the studios a few minutes ago, has been saying that she would actually like to learn to become a bus driver. She's been operating heavy equipment on the farm for many, many years and feels that this is just the next step. She could do some bus driving and then get a job working around that as well. Also coming up on the program with us next Wednesday between 8:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning, our good friends from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls will be joining us on air. The medical professionals, they join us, talk about any number of things. This past week, we talked about children's health. We're going to talk in coming weeks again about various issues that you may have when it comes to your own health. And you always have an opportunity to telephone us during that segment and actually speak to the doctor on air or one of the medical associates, and they can answer your questions. And this is, let's face it, this is getting free advice from somebody in the medical professions, not always easy to get. So you have that opportunity. Remember, Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine in Twin Falls. They are across from the post office on Fillmore Street. Life's too short not to feel good. I have a guest coming up in just a few minutes. His name is Jake Smith. Jake is a safety consultant. He works with broadcasters all over the country and really world in advising them if they're doing any particular things on the set. That is the movie set or the live show set or any of these other things that they're doing to produce a show. He is the fellow who walks in, examines the situation, and tells them what would be too dangerous and what their liability would be if they would go ahead with that. Well, he found a link the other day that he shared with me that says Idaho is a very dangerous state, not from crime, but from accidents. Accidents at home, accidents in the workplace, and he'd like to share some thoughts with us coming up in just a few minutes. That's on the way. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 48 at our studios, 20 minutes from 9 o'clock. Question, is Idaho a dangerous place to live? That's a question that I think has been raised by some people because of perhaps a rate of accidents that could happen in the workplace or in the home, and could put the state among the leading places in the country when it comes to danger. And we're not talking, as I said earlier, about criminal danger. We're talking about other things that perhaps you could clear up if we just were a little bit maybe more alert. 844-48 at our studios. This is News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, which of course means you can listen to us anywhere around the world by clicking on the Listen Live icon. A handful of my very demented friends actually do that most mornings. I do thank them for it, though, and, I perhaps should refer to them in some nicer tones. We have a very special guest joining me, Bill Colley, this morning. His name is Jake Smith, and he is with a business called Media Safety Services. In fact, he's the founder of that business, and the business is designed to work with people, especially in media, who are putting on productions, and they don't need to have people badly hurt or dying. Think back when the movie was being made, Twilight Zone, in the early 1980s, and the actor Vic Morrow and some children were killed because somebody decided that they should do a stunt that went haywire. Well, there are ways, if you plan, you can avoid those things. First of all, Jake, welcome to our program.
Bill, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
You've worked on a number of different shows. You've worked with a number of different networks. I was mentioning before you came on the air that you worked on a couple of reality shows with Ted Nugent. You worked on the TV show Jackass, which obviously raised some safety concerns.
Gee, I wonder why, Bill.
Yes, somebody getting hit in the head with a board, I guess, could do that. You saw this link the other day, and you sent it to me about the state of Idaho, and apparently Idaho not necessarily known as a safe place at times.
Well, Bill, it's funny. I looked at this OSHA report, and the report focused on workplace fatalities. And in case your listeners aren't aware, if there is a fatality in the workplace, the employer is required to report that fatality to OSHA within 8 hours. Now, a lot of workplace fatalities never get reported to OSHA. Now, I think you and I would probably both agree that perhaps under the Obama administration, OSHA's been used for things other than really ensuring workplace safety. They've been used to target Tea Party groups. If you're a member of a Tea Party group and you wanted to get no tax status from the government, well, you had a business, they would have OSHA visit you to see if you were in compliance, which isn't obviously the best way to generate safe working environments. But what was I thought interesting about the story that came out from the Boise OSHA office was the rash of fatalities for farms. Now, you obviously lived in Delaware before you moved out to Idaho, Bill, and you know both locations, both states are agriculture states. But agriculture business, can be working on a farm can be somewhat dangerous. But what's happened, I think, over the last few years is the influx of immigrants, both legal and illegal, that have come into the workplace from places that, quite frankly, don't have any workplace safety rules in place, from countries that don't have any structured workplace safety. And you're beginning to see an uptick in, perhaps workplace accidents, although fatalities is what was being reported. And so I think if you look at the... Go ahead. I'm sorry, Bill.
No, finish up on that thought, please.
Well, I was going to... Basically, you're going to see two issues here with the number of immigrants going into and working in agriculture. First of all, the language barrier, obviously. Many of the workplace safety programs, although required by OSHA to be provided in whatever language the worker speaks, generally probably have not been translated into Spanish, and the different dialects in Spanish which have to be addressed, because every area that you speak Spanish is different. And the other thing is risk takers. I mean, you see that in immigrant workers that work with in the construction industry. These people that go up and do roofs. I mean, they take risks that American workers weren't taking, and those, I think, that's two risk factors that are causing problems in workplaces, and you're seeing it here in Idaho.
I had a friend, of course, who ran a dairy farm for decades, and had been in his family since, I guess, the 1830s. And in the first few years he was doing it, he was extremely cautious, and yet I would visit and I would notice some of the safety precautions that he would take. However, he dropped a wagon tongue on a foot and limped for many, many months afterwards. Later on, while he was trying to clean up in the barn, he slipped in with one of the byproducts of his cattle, and he blew out a knee. He was always concerned about climbing up the silo because he would have to do that periodically.
And that's dangerous, yeah.
In fact, yeah, you're using a ladder that is essentially just a series of metal steps that these rings that come out. You're walking up and down, so you've got all of that going on. I think a lot of the people you reference, the immigration, the people who are coming here from elsewhere, do not necessarily have a lot of experience with a lot of the machinery because farming may be in a much cruder form where they've come from.
19th century, sure. Yeah,
so they're walking into a situation with power equipment and heavy equipment, and I would imagine if no one is really giving them much of a course in what they're doing, they're learning on the job. Unfortunately, they're learning a lot of bad habits.
Well, that is true, and I think that one of the concerns is the lack of safety, structure, and responsibility. I mean, on most farms, and if you ask a farmer, who's that go-to person that is responsible for OSHA compliance at that farm, you might find that you get this person pointing to this person or that person pointing to that person. Every farm really needs to have that go-to person. Who's the one that's responsible for that? The problem is, when you look at all the things that farmers have to contend with today, all the regulations, they've got the EPA breathing down their backs, they've got other departments in Washington breathing down their backs, they may have even state agencies doing the same. They may not have enough time or money to have a structured OSHA safety program. So I think what really needs to be done is that if there's a farmers association, they need to address this by having computer-based automated safety training programs that are done in various languages that are available to the farmers, where they can sit their workers down in front of a computer terminal and have them go through this online program. It's done around the country, but in farming, perhaps that is something that can be done by a bunch of farmers getting together and forming a group that can do this, or perhaps insurance companies getting together. In years past, insurance companies used to provide these services. They don't anymore because of cutbacks in the services that insurance companies provide.
Our guest is Jake Smith. He is the founder of Media Safety Services, 851 and 49 at our studios on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. You can listen to us anywhere around the world, of course, by checking us out online and clicking on the Listen Live icon. Jake, one of the things as you bring all of this up, it strikes me that an online course is probably the simplest way to do it to reach the most people. But if you were to I think anybody, if they were to walk through an operation, whether it be a dairy operation or a beef cattle operation, or just if they have a vegetable farm, and there are certain things that I don't care where you go, you're always going to be able to point to this and say, that could be a problem. That could be a problem. Right. If they just could have someone walk through with them once, you might solve a lot of these issues.
Well, your local OSHA office is available, Bill, to provide you with that type of consultation. I mean, OSHA is supposed to be doing that. That's the reason why, under the Nixon administration, the occupational safety and health rules were approved in the Federal Register, the Code of Federal Regulations back then. The problem is that I think that OSHA has become an agency that perhaps is not trusted. And if you look at, again, what's happened under the Obama administration, where they've been using OSHA as a weapon against, Tea Party groups and that type of thing, you may be a farmer, you may not want to have OSHA come because you feel that OSHA is going to recognize too many problems and they could shut down your business. Could they do that? Yes. If they recognize hazards in the workplace that were severe enough, could they shut you down until those hazards were addressed? They could do that. Generally, what they will do is they will give you 30 days to fix something that's been a problem, and then all you need to do is fax them a letter or email them a letter saying that what they identified had been taken care of. But I guess like a lot of government agencies, the Big Brother syndrome, people are afraid to invite OSHA to their business, even though OSHA could provide the kind of technical support to agriculture that they could use.
I think there's a lot of truth in this, that a lot of these government agencies, it's a bit like there was a Star Trek Next Generation episode some years ago where they had a probe that was coming in from an alternate universe, and when they got rid of it, at the end, the captain says something along the lines of, well, now they know where we are. I fear they're going to be visiting us again. And
Right.
you have these people come out, and you've got to realize they make their money by, number one, writing citations, or they justify their existence by finding
Right.
problems. So
Right.
they can have a very big smile on their face and say, I'm here to help you. But you know what? When push comes to shove and they need that budget for that office, or they want a larger budget for that office, they say, well, look at all of these write-ups we did in this past year. We're going to need more people and more money. And I think that most people have a pretty good understanding of how that bureaucracy now works.
Well, that's true. And if you look at agriculture, the two areas of OSHA compliance that are more problematic than any two are lockout tagout, which is the requirement that you lock a piece of machinery out or that you lock a piece of electrical equipment out so that if you're working on it, somebody can't go by and say, oh, why is this switched off, and then turn it on and then kill the person who's working on it. The other thing is confined space entry, which is the grain silo issue, which you mentioned, people having to crawl inside grain silos at various times. Those are the two big hot buttons for OSHA today, lockout, tagout, and confined space entry, which are very easily addressed via training and proper equipment. But again, as you say, that Star Trek: The Next Generation episode, now we know where they are. Given all the bad publicity from Lois Lerner and the other things, perhaps people are not taking advantage of the types of services that the government should be providing because of all the bad stuff that's come out the last few years. Got
a couple of minutes left. You had referenced some of the regulations and a lot of the newer regulations. These businesses are so heavily regulated. For instance, by the EPA. Now, most farms, if they have they have to have if you have so many hundred head of cattle, you have to have so many 100 acres for dispersal of the manure. And some farms have these great big manure pits. And
did Al Gore have anything to do with that regulation, by the way?
Probably he did. We've had these terrible accidents, and I read about them now and then, where someone will end up drowning in one of these pits, these accidents.
Yep.
And it's just gut-wrenching, and it shows you as well that perhaps the idea behind this, someone in Washington said this is a great idea, but in the long run, putting it into practice has only made more dangers.
Well, Bill, that is a very good point. Didn't think of that. Here you have the EPA, and we all know how the EPA is, driving us crazy with climate change stuff today. But here you have a situation where perhaps they have created a hazard by these increased government regulations. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Got it. Before you go today, I got to let you know that we're having some Highland games at a local college tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
Completely different subject. And I know you have been a participant often in some of those Scottish or Celtic games in the past.
Yeah.
What should I look forward to if I attend one of these tomorrow, or what should I look out for, speaking of safety?
Well, I wouldn't stand near where they're tossing the caber, Bill. That's going to be one thing I would definitely recommend, because you could be struck on the head by a caber. But the Highland dancing has always been a favorite of mine, and I would definitely, if I could, watch how many pipe bands are going to be there. Sounds like a really nice event. Yeah. I wish I could put on my kilt and get on a plane and come over there. I'd come.
I took my daughter to one of these when she was a little girl, and right. She loved the bagpipes. She cared nothing about people throwing bags over goalposts, but for some reason it wasn't. I wanted her to sample some of the Scottish food, but instead they had what were called ice cream dots. Somebody was promoting, so she wanted some of those, and she managed to get the ice cream from her hands all the way to her elbows, and we had to cancel our visit early to go home and clean up. But you know what? That's not a serious hazard. That's just childhood.
Listen, what might be a hazard is haggis, though. Have you ever had haggis, Bill?
Yes.
Okay, just checking.
Hey,
now listen, Bill. Before I go, just let me hear you say who's in first place in the National League East and who has the best record in all of baseball.
It won't last, but the New York Mets.
Okay, thank you. At least I lived long enough to hear you say that, Bill.
Hey, thank you for taking some time with us this morning.
Anytime, Bill.
Super. Take care.
Bye.
Jake Smith joining us this morning. He is the founder of Media Safety Services, and spent some time with us because he came across a story earlier this week about some of the hazards, workplace hazards, that he pointed out, especially on farms in the state of Idaho. And his business is to ensure that that they go to work and that they leave work in one piece. I want to thank him for taking some time out with us. Jake is also a one-time broadcaster, having been a reporter with a travel channel. He worked in television news and worked in talk radio as well, and just a super all-around guy. Coming up, one more hour of the program, but first, news from Fox. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX. You probably heard the story already. There was a moose that had to be removed from a park in Boise yesterday. The moose had been spotted a couple of times, and then the second time around, the moose was grazing in the park, so they had to keep the park off limits for people because the 2-year-old cow still is a very big animal, and moose can be temperamental. I had a couple of moose experiences when I was younger, and they're sometimes shy. I was in an automobile, though, both times, and perhaps they didn't want to take on the automobile. But if I had just been standing directly in front of them, who knows? I might not be here talking with you today. 48 at our studios. 7 minutes after 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. So they managed to tranquilize her, and they got her out of the area, which is, I guess, a good thing. Keeps her safe, keeps everybody in the neighborhood safe, and she's gone and out of the way. This morning as well, the Associated Press wire was just filled with stories about birds. Yeah, about some seabirds who are nesting in Idaho, as well as sage grouse. And, of course, a lot of people out there are saying that we need to protect all of these animals. We had the conversation the other day on the air about how difficult it is to actually protect them when every time they go flying on the flight path, they got to get whacked by one of those great big propellers out there that are spinning around generating electricity from the wind. Somebody didn't think about that when they were designing it all. Moose are big animals. I mean, moose and grizzly bear are probably the biggest animals you're going to encounter if you're out and about this summer somewhere in the region. However, things could be changing. They could become secondary because scientists claim they're about ready to start reproducing the woolly mammoth, which has been extinct now for a few millennia. From the Washington Post. The Washington Post science desk, very busy the last couple of days. First of all, as we mentioned in the last hour of the program, we have an issue perhaps with the volcano at Yellowstone, which could blow us all to kingdom come sometime. Well, if not tomorrow, sometime over the next 60,000 to 100,000 years. And it's going to be a very big boom potentially when it goes up. But according to the Post science writers, right now, some old tusks that were recovered from the skeletonized remains of some woolly mammoth, they managed to DNA or sequence the DNA from those tusks. And what they're looking at doing is reproducing mammoth. True story. And I think how this works is you take that DNA sequence. Well, the Chinese have already said that they can now go into an embryo and genetically engineer children, and then plant those embryos or reimplant them, and that those children will then grow up with the various features that the parents want. Gosh, you really wonder if we want to start going down this road, because if you remember the story Brave New World, Huxley's Brave New World, there were people who were bred simply to live and work underground in the mines. They were all about 4 feet high, and then we could end up with various classifications of people. It could be a brand new caste system instituted by genetic engineering. The mammoth, on the other hand, there is a reason they would like to bring it back. According to one Russian biologist, they would like to release the mammoth out on the steppes of Asia. And according to him, if the mammoths start wandering Siberia again and start feeding in Siberia, they will actually help promote the growth of natural grasses. And those grasses, he says, will also protect the permafrost. And they'd like to protect the permafrost because, of course, the global warming acolytes all claim if the permafrost melts, that there's a lot of methane gas down there that will suddenly all be vented up into the sky, and then the earth will become warmer and warmer and warmer, and we'll all be sitting around sweating profusely on a daily basis. Well, none of us do that pretty often anyway, but it'll be a lot worse is what they're telling us. 11 minutes after 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. This is News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com online. If you'd like to reach our program today, you could give us a call at 736-0300, 736-0300. Now, we're going to find out if this actually happens, if the woolly mammoth is as nice as the one that was in that movie. We just heard about the TV show tragedy related to one of the cast members of the TV show Everybody Loves Raymond. Well, you may remember Ray Romano in those Ice Age movies voicing the woolly mammoth, and I don't know that they're anywhere near as nice as Ray Romano. I really have a feeling that if you were to challenge them as you might challenge a moose, that great big old mammoth is likely going to mow you down. Big tusks and very heavy, and would stomp all over you in that particular situation. But I did want to share that off the top because speaking of the environmentalists, I happened to see this morning. Now that we are a few days past Earth Day, we can all relax. Yes, we can all go back to tossing garbage out our windows as we're driving down the road and making that old Indian tear up and cry. He's long dead though now, isn't he? That's true. But we have this. In fact, he's somewhere underground now, and his remains leaching into the soil. So that's natural. That's natural decay versus, let's say, throwing some styrofoam out your car window if you're driving. Not that we're throwing styrofoam out our windows. It's usually when I'm driving along, I don't really see people littering much, but I see that people have littered, and usually what it happens to be is Olympia cans. That type of thing that is thrown out, and that isn't going to go away anywhere near as quickly as some sort of organic matter if it was tossed out along the road or buried in the ground. This is from a blog called the Powerline blog, and the writer is John Hindraker. Democrats raise money by lying about the climate. Who would have thought? Democrats lie? Gosh, but it's the party of Hillary Clinton. How could that be? The writer says, I suppose it was Earth Day that prompted a mass email on climate from the Democrat Party. What is striking about the Democrats' fundraising pitch is its mendacity. Here it is in pieces. You remember that movie many, many years ago? Was it Joanne Woodward? And she was in the movie along with he was quite famous at the time. He was Robert Redford's partner in a lot of movies, Paul Newman. And I believe there was another character in the movie who would sit around, and it might have been, I don't recall, but I'm going to say it was Burl Ives, and he would sit around and he would say, mendacity. He was pretty mendacious himself. Burl Ives was a communist, if you didn't know that, and he managed to maintain and keep his career during the big scare in the early 1950s because he testified on Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and all of the other communists out there. He turned table and gave them all the names, and that allowed him to maintain a career in show business. But overall, I don't think he ever changed his anti-American views. Here was what the Democrat Party sent out. 2014 was the Earth's warmest year on record. Well, Mr. Hindraker says, I wrote a long post on the falsity of this claim. He said, was 2014 really the warmest year ever? The key point is, he says, is that on record means since 1880, i.e. roughly the end of the Little Ice Age. He says, satellite data, the only transparent and uncorporated or corrupted, I'm still reading here with a light out over my head, uncorrupted temperature record indicates that 2014 was either the third or maybe the sixth warmest year since 1979 when satellite data began, but the differences are negligible. More importantly, we are living, he says, in a relatively cool era. Ice core data indicate that it is cooler now than it has been around 90% of the time since the last ice age. Who'd have thunk it? You hear all of these people screaming and yelling about how the earth is coming to an end and we just keep living like we're living. What they want to do, and I read something about this today from Lamar Smith. Lamar Smith is a congressman. Now, I hope you don't hold that against him, but he's writing in the Wall Street Journal. He has a guest piece there today, and I found this on page 2 of his column. Climate reports from the UN, that's the United Nations, which the Obama White House consistently embraces, are designed to provide scientific cover for a preordained policy. This is not good science. Christiana Figueres, the official leading the UN's effort to forge a new international climate treaty later this year in Paris, told reporters in February that the real goal is to change the economic development model that has been reigning for the last 150 years. In other words, since the pretty much the end of the Little Ice Age, we should point out, which kept things cold around the world and economies did not develop. Funny, about the same time that was coming to an end, industrialization started, and man came up with all sorts of gadgets that made our lives easier as well as extended our lifespans, in fact, about doubled them over the last 120 years. The writer says, in other words, a central objective of these negotiations is to redistribute wealth among nations. It is apparent that President Obama shares this vision. So all of that hoo-ha this week. Hey, speaking of President Obama, I've got a break coming up in a couple of minutes. Fellow I used to work with by the name of Bill Rogers posted something on Facebook, and I haven't had an opportunity to mention it yet. President Obama came out yesterday morning, had a very brief exchange in the White House press room where he talked a bit about a drone strike that killed a couple of hostages, one of them being an American, as well as a couple of bad guys who were apparently also Americans, that took place in Pakistan. But it took place in January. Now, I have a calendar somewhere in the office, and January was a long time ago when it comes to releasing news about these things. You've had February, March, and most of April now have gone by. So we've had about 90 days or more since this actually happened. And I guess the family of the guy, the American who was killed, is just learning about this. Gee, you wonder, he's been dead and gone 3.5 months. Why it took so long for the White House to say, oh, shucks, we killed him. Sorry. But why yesterday? Why yesterday? Well, think about this. My friend Bill Rogers says there was some really bad news yesterday about Mr. Obama's anointed successor. There was some bad news that said that Hillary Clinton, while she was serving in the State Department, that she and her husband's foundation was taking millions of dollars from some Russian business tycoons. Shortly thereafter, the Clintonistas got together, and at the State Department, they awarded the Russians access to a uranium mine here in the United States. Because you know the Russians, they're good guys, and of course they're always our friends. And what could they possibly do with uranium? Oh, give it to Iran, I suppose, so they could make some more bombs, so that we could keep the balance of order in the Middle East. So this story came out, and if it's true, it just shows you, by the way, about the traitorous nature of the Clinton family, that they will put profits well ahead, of course, of their country. It is unconscionable. But that story was going to get a lot of traction and a lot of headlines. However, suddenly President Obama comes out and says, hey, I accidentally killed some Americans 3 months ago. Yeah, that's the ticket. And all of a sudden, the Hillary story gets pushed out of the way. Do you think that somehow the Clintons still may have Mr. Obama by the short hairs? They know things about him. They were the ones, it has now been proven, that released the details and had the video of Reverend Jeremiah Wright screaming, no, not God bless America, but God, America. A word I couldn't use in there. This is family radio. You know, I just don't agree with that sort of stuff. But it was the Clintons who came across the video and released it to the media. If they know that about Mr. Obama, they likely also know a lot of other nasty things about him. And what they've probably done is they probably went to him and said, you are going to do a favor for us today. Remember those guys you killed 3 months ago? You're going to have to come up and fess up about it because, frankly, you're not going anywhere after this election, but we are. I think there's something going on here, quid pro quo, with these two former presidents, or former president, current president, and possibly future president. 20 minutes after 9 o'clock. Bill Colley with you. 49 at our studios. You're listening to me on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, where you can hear us online anywhere all over the world. By the way, if you want to give me a telephone call after the other side of this break, when some of our friends, of course, have some fine messages, feel free to give me a shout at 736-0300. Keep me company on this Friday morning. I have been reading, since I was just on that subject a couple of minutes ago, I have been reading some of the comments this morning in some of the largest liberal newspapers in the country about the Clintonistas. It's funny because you almost can see. There's a guy at the Washington Post. His name is Chris Saliza. And I happened to be, there's a massive volcano going up right now. Rodrigo Barrera. Here we were talking volcanoes earlier in the program. Anyway, speaking of the Clintons and volcanic eruptions, this guy Chris Saliza at the Washington Post was writing today about how, and I found it at Real Clear Politics, excellent website if you'd like to keep track of some of the best writing about these issues in America, as well as they always have posted a great many videos too, so you can see Jonah Goldberg, Charles Krauthammer. You can even see some of the MSDNC crowd on that very website too as well. Not that you'd want to, I know, especially not during a meal. That'd probably make you gag, but you know, Chris Matthews is enough to gag a maggot. We all know that. And Rachel Maddow, anyway. I'm starting to digress a lot here, and we don't want to do that too often. But this guy, Chris Eliza at the Washington Post, it's like he's walking through a minefield trying to talk about the difficulties. He keeps going back to the conclusion that, well, Hillary Clinton's probably still going to win. But yeah, she may have broken the law, but Hillary Clinton's still going to win. Somebody asked me, I commented at the end of his story. They have a little thing there where you can, as a reader, comment. I always use my real name as well. I don't use any of those phony made-up names because I'm not afraid of anything. But I put a comment down and said, look, I've been reading that Robert Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, got indicted by the Obama White House, that is, by its arm in the Attorney General's office, for far less, for doing something similar but far less. So somebody wrote and said, please cite, some liberal wrote back and said, please cite the law that you are speaking of. Well, again, if Menendez just got indicted for the possibility of thinking about it, whatever law he got indicted under, then Hillary should be indicted under that. Like I'm supposed to pull out the statute, with the funny-looking S, the stylistic S, and then, a bunch of numbers and dashes and the like. I guess that would satisfy them. So they are in such denial. But as I was reading this column from this guy, it made me think, they're still trying to figure out how can we pull her across the finish line. And what they're going to do is they'll wait a few weeks and then say, well, this is old news, just like they're now doing with the email server. This is old news. And yet they'll turn around when you get down to the final 3 or 4 big Republicans, just like they did Mitt Romney in 2012. Remember, there was a story in that very same newspaper, Pravda on the Potomac, Washington Post. They published a story saying Mitt Romney was a bully when he was in high school. Maybe. Maybe was the key word. Yeah, that was 40-some years ago. Well, yes, but he wasn't very nice to another boy at school, according to the brother of that other boy. But the other boy's not alive anymore, so we can't actually get his statement. But we're going to say it anyway. They will come out. That's old news, friends. That's 40 years ago. 9:27. You're on the air with Bill Colley. What's on your mind?
Yeah, good morning, Bill. Thanks for taking my call. This after Benghazi, after the emails, all this stuff been going on. If the American people don't stand up and say, we want the FBI and the Justice Department to investigate this, if the FBI and Justice Department won't do it, and the people don't make them, then the people are going to get what they got coming. This thing with the Russians, it absolutely makes the rest of it hell in comparison.
Yeah.
This is crazy. This is as close to treasonous. In fact, I put it not too far if what I'm hearing is true. Now, first, let me say this. First, I hope it's not true. I really do. I hope there's no basis to this at all, because if it does, it's going to hurt this country. But if it is true, this is not too far off from back in the 50s when that husband and wife, I can't remember their names, gave the secrets to the Russians.
Oh, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. And they were executed for this. Now, people are going to say, oh, you're talking about executing Hillary and Bill. No, I'm not. I just want the damn thing investigated.
Yeah.
If this was a Republican doing this, Democrats would be going freaking crazy right now.
Yeah, I thank you much for the telephone call. I think your analysis is spot on with all of this. The Rosenbergs were selling nuclear secrets to the Russians. I had someone call me on a show one time and say, well, how do you actually know that? Because you know what? After the Soviet Union fell, they opened up the doors to their archives and said, here you go. Here's the evidence that we were buying the nuclear secrets from them. So, yes, they were guilty as sin. And right now, the Clintons are the very same. And frankly, even though there were not a lot of shots, when my dad was serving in the post-war period in Germany, he did tell me, he said there were times that they were firing back and forth with the Russians, but these things never got out of hand. They could have, but they never got seriously out of hand. We were in a state of war with the Russians as the Soviets for 45 years following World War II. We're still basically in a state of war with them. It's been revived, and here we are. Here these people are turning over a uranium mine. And, there's no independent Soviet businessmen. They're all working for Vladimir Putin. They're all vassals of King Vladimir. And they're turning over whatever they make, a certain amount of the profit. It's like going up to the mafia don and saying, oh, thank you for your protection, and sliding off a few dollars of whatever you've made for his cut. This is a very, very serious matter. And we've got to nip this in the bud. And the fact of the matter is we have to stop these people now. And the folks in media who say, well, even a traitorous, crooked Hillary Clinton is better than any Republican. You're not in a position to make that judgment. That's for the American people. Your job is just to report the facts. and to dig into this and not be lazy. 48, 930. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. I heard that commercial for Kimberly Suds a couple of minutes ago. I was in Kimberly last Saturday morning. And early in the morning, there's not a lot going on a Saturday in Kimberly, but Kimberly Suds was busy. People going in and out the door. Well, you want to get your laundry done early. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, meaning you can hear us anywhere online all over the world. 48 at our studios. It's 9:34. I believe we have a caller joining us, and you're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX. What's on your mind?
Hi, Bill from Michigan. We're at the airport, but I just wanted to remind you about the Lincoln Day breakfast in Jerome, Idaho tomorrow morning.
10 a.m.
Okay, I promised I would remind you.
Yes, and again, it's going to be right downtown somewhere, right?
Yes, it's at the Senior Center.
Oh, I won't miss that. Of course,
you won't miss it.
I'm now AARP eligible.
Well, anyway, the weather's great here. Is it good in Idaho?
Unfortunately, no.
No. Well, tomorrow will be beautiful, maybe, and we'll have a lovely day with the legislators. So that should be interesting.
Well, now, which airport are you at in Michigan?
O'Hare.
Oh, that's in Chicago then, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's right. This is not Michigan. This is Illinois. We've crossed the line.
I have been in and out of that Detroit airport a few times, and
yeah.
I'm just going to tell you, it's a highly disappointing place to spend time. The pizza's expensive. You wait a long time for your connector. In fact, the only times I've ever had turbulence flying, bad turbulence, was coming out of Detroit twice.
Yeah. Well, we're happy to be coming back to Idaho, but we've had a lovely week in Michigan, and so we'll see you in the morning in Jerome at the Senior Center.
Super. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. Thanks, Bill.
Take care now. The Women's Republican Club, of course, in Jerome County, putting together a breakfast tomorrow, and I'm going to drop by and say hello to everybody and just get a feel for the Republican Party in the area, and just it's more conservative than Republicans east of the Mississippi River. Trust me. And when I was in Detroit, Michigan last fall, working on a U.S. Senate campaign for a Republican candidate she was not the most competent of candidates I ever came across. But there you go again. Republicans have difficulty in some of those eastern and industrialized states because they try to appease too many people on the left and they annoy their own base. And we don't have too much of that going on in Idaho. Oh, maybe I hear one name that pops up frequently, but most people are happy with their Republican representation in the state. That's why we have so much of it. Speaking of happy, I am happy that so many people make this show possible, including the good folks at Western States Bus Services, where they are hiring part-time bus drivers right now. Split shifts 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled, no school days. Pay is $10.75 per hour. You can apply today. You can contact 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. We talked a bit earlier about how the media treats the Clintonistas with kid gloves. The Clintonistas, that comes from the old Peronistas out of Argentina. And they are very much like Juan and Evita Perón. They are people out to plunder the country for their own benefit. And yet media still says, well, yeah, but she had to do it. Yeah. She had to lie and steal and cheat. Yeah. Because that's the only way she could get around that vast right-wing conspiracy. No wonder she's paranoid. But you know what? This vindicates all of us on the right who were warning about the Clintons in the 1990s. With the Whitewater land deal, the cattle futures deal, Vince Foster, all of these, it vindicates everything we are saying. This shows the pattern of depravity that these people exhibit. Meanwhile, how would you think that they would treat a conservative or a Republican in establishment media? Here's a good example. Daily Signal. National Palestinian Radio cut Dana Perino's heartwarming story about George W. Bush. Dana Perino was a spokeswoman for George W. Bush near the end of his presidential term, second term, And she has written a book about their time together. She was doing an interview about this with NPR yesterday morning, taped interview. And she told the story about how a woman, angry with the president, berated him while he was visiting wounded warriors. True story. She's not holding anything back. But she also told the story. She shared the story during her interview about how while Mr. Bush was presenting, there was a wounded Marine who was apparently unconscious, with tubes sticking out of him all over the place. They were awarding him the Purple Heart, and afterward, the man's little 4-year-old boy walked up and asked the president what the Purple Heart was. The president got down on his knees to talk to the little boy face to face. And as he explained how brave his father was and the wonderful things he had done for his country, the Marine suddenly woke up and his eyes opened, and the president went forward and leaned over to speak with the Marine. And at one point, he broke into tears, and he leaned over and he put his forehead up against the Marine's forehead. And at that point, everyone in the room was incredibly touched. NPR cut that part of the interview out. Why? We can't have a Republican looking good. Heck no. Here's socialist radio. They take your tax money. I heard one of these guys on one of the begathons say one time, well, we only get 60% of our funding any longer from taxpayers. Yeah. And I know a girl who's a little bit pregnant. I'll take some of your telephone calls coming up in a few minutes, but we have a hard break. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Have you ever heard the name John Podhoretz? If you listen to Rush Limbaugh, you hear Podhoretz quoted frequently. He's one of the leading right-wing writers in the country, and I say that in all due respect, coming from that particular persuasion myself. And at Commentary, he has a piece today where he's talking about, this is the headline, the Clinton cash allegations are a test of the Democrat Party's health. You know something? This is a bit like, this is the moral equivalent of having gonorrhea. If you want to talk about the Democrat Party's health, they've got a serious STD going on right now. It's 9:44. Well, she is married to Bill Clinton. That is a serious possibility, isn't it? That he could literally, well, it's 9:45, 48 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You could reach our program by giving me a telephone call at 736-0300. That is 736-0300. Or drop me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. I was just looking at email a minute ago, and there was an email from a fellow I respect a great deal, and it said lost puppy. So I thought it was a real update about a lost puppy, but it's actually a story. And so I don't have any lost puppy reports to share with you at the moment. 9:45, as I mentioned. We have a caller with us on News Radio 1310 KLIX, and you're up next.
Hey, Bill, I hope I'm not repeating myself here, but do you remember a talk show host from Florida? He got broadcast from some hotel down there, and his name was Heavyset Guy, Chuck Harder. Do you remember him?
Yeah, vaguely, yeah.
Well, he was, I used to listen to it because he was broadcasting locally for years, and during the Clinton administration, what all the terrible things that these people have done, and the evidence was overwhelming. But again, the media and everybody was, in on the fix, so to speak. But, the amount of stuff that these people have done to get where they are, it was so much that we've forgotten most of it. But, they eventually did him in. And I mean, not literally. I think he's still alive, maybe. I don't know. But he made it his life mission to, upset them. But he ended up losing anyway, as most people have, I guess.
Well, and I thank you much for the call. I had a coworker years ago by the name of Brett Haas. And Brett had an uncle who worked in the federal government. He had some office, non-distinct office. And one night he was driving home from work. Now, I have been to Fort Marcy Park. I went there with some friends. We went to a Tea Party rally in 2010, and we were down there for the whole weekend in Washington. So we decided to go over and see this park, which is where Vince Foster's supposedly committed suicide. Well, Brett's uncle was driving home from work that night when he suddenly had a realization that nature was calling, and he did not have time to make it home. So he thought he would pull into, and Fort Marcy Park, as I discovered, is very, very isolated. He pulled off the highway and into the park. And he got there thinking, I'll relieve myself here. And he saw a bunch of men in dark suits with black cars. And they just simply said, get out of here. And he ended up going on a radio show with, you may remember G. Gordon Liddy. Liddy did a radio show for many, many years. And Liddy was doing a lot of research into this too as well, looking for a connection between the Clinton White House, of course, and Foster's death maybe not being a suicide. Liddy, by the way, is retired now, retired about a year ago. My friend, another friend of mine, by the way, I should point out, Jim de Blasi, Jim's best friend when he was in the Marine Corps was Liddy's son. So I was always hoping to get Gordon on the air, but I still haven't managed to do that yet. You're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
You know, I thought I shouldn't call, but I thought I would.
Patrick.
My brother, it is so good to hear you again. I'm not calling to rant. I'll do that over the text messages or the email for you.
Sure.
But just wanted to say you sound great and tell all your listeners out there, this is a great man, you all. He is a leader. He's got a great voice, and he's got a spine and a pair of stones.
Yeah, the check is in the mail.
This gentleman on the radio. He's great.
Check.
I love him to death. I wish he was still here with us. We're fighting the philacracy back here. Julie's still fighting at the Supreme Court for the new one. I don't know if you heard about it. The voting in Kent County for the Register of Wills was a little hinky. So she took it all the way to the Supreme Court and argued it last tax day, actually.
Well, Patrick, if you're still looking for a little liberty, this may be the last place you'll find it. Maybe here or Texas.
Yeah, we're looking at both, actually. We really are.
And then we can go jumping off the bridge together. We can grab our parachutes and spend our weekends flying through the air.
Hoorah, brother! Let's do it. Come here.
Hey, thank you for the call.
You got it, brother. Stay safe out there.
All right, thank you. My friend Patrick, as I mentioned yesterday, is a retired undercover federal narcotics investigator. And probably one of the, by the way, a great baseball player. He has competed on a couple of occasions in the Senior League World Series, playing for an organization called the Purdue Chicks. Yes, there is such a baseball team, and he has participated in that World Series on a number of occasions, too, as well. You wouldn't want to mess with the guy. Mike Huckabee coming up next. The Huckabee Report is brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. The telephone number, 736-6563. That is 736-6563. Going to miss Huckabee on air, but I do think he's going to have a great deal to contribute to the Republican primary situation coming up next year. The same guy I mentioned, Chris Saliza from the Washington Post earlier today, who was trying, he was going to throw his back out. He was contorting himself so much trying to defend Hillary Clinton, because that's what they do in establishment media. They try to haul their fellow travelers across the finish line. Well, he was jokingly saying there are 20 Republican candidates or more. Well, why not? You know what? If we had 50 to choose from, wouldn't that be better? Isn't choice a good thing? You know, the word choice is just a synonym for liberty. You think about that for a moment. Liberty is just a series of choices you can make. And if someone takes your choices away, you don't have any liberty. You understand very much how that works, I think. It's 9:55. Bill Colley with you this morning. Got a couple of minutes before we wrap up today. If you'd like to be the very last voice on the air today, you can give me a shout at 736-0300. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as News Radio 1310.com. Yeah, ton. Some days it feels like it's weighing a ton, doesn't it? The tongue feels like it's weighing a ton at the moment. News Radio 1310.com means you can hear us online anywhere by clicking on the Listen Live button. 48 at the studios. And I do want to mention, before we wrap up today, God willing and the creek don't rise, or the Clintons don't get me, I'll be back here on Monday morning between 8 and 10 o'clock in the morning, and I hope you can join me then. We do have a wonderful lineup, though, that follows me during the course of the day. Rush Limbaugh, in talk radio, well, he's not just, I think, the greatest talk radio host of all time. He might be the greatest broadcaster ever, hands down. Because what he does, a lot of guys can sit around and front sell an album or a song playing, and then back sell a song a few songs later, and play 10 in a row and tell you they're going to play 10 more in a row, and make some little 15-second quip about some Hollywood celebrity. I think that's fairly simple to do, but to sit down and actually do a 3-hour talk show, and you realize some days the first 2.5 hours of Rush's show is simply a monologue. It's incredible that the man can actually do that and make it so compelling, and he's been doing it for a quarter century. That's a skill. I don't know anyone else who has a skill similar. Glenn Beck. I love Glenn Beck to death, but Glenn Beck does a show with a whole series of other guys in the studio with him. Over on sports radio, if you listen to some of the people like Dan Patrick who dominate that medium, Dan Patrick has a whole series of guys who he bounces things off with too as well. Rush is simply there alone every day, just doing it. There are no guests for the most part, sometimes no callers. And yet he still leads the pack. It's just an amazing thing. He'll be up following Fox News at 10 o'clock today. Sean Hannity coming up following Fox News at 1 o'clock. Beck following news at 4 o'clock. Dave Ramsey tonight. And by the way, I had made fun of Coast to Coast the other day. Jerome Corsi was on Coast to Coast this morning. If you do not know who Jerome Corsi is, go look him up on the computer. I've got a couple of his books on the shelf at home. And that man, when he puts his nose to the grindstone, is one of the best investigative reporters in the world. And he has been looking into the Clinton situation. He has mainly been ignored by his fellows in mainstream media for years. But I've got a funny feeling that a lot of this Clinton, how shall we put it, circus is now going to finally go mainstream. We can only hope. By the way, God bless you all. Have a great weekend. I'm looking forward to getting out a little bit myself this weekend, and just a lot of things to do, a lot of people to meet. And as I said earlier, God willing and the creek don't rise, I'm back here on Monday morning.